Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Pawn e4 to e5. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight g1 to f3. Queen d8 to b6. Knight b1 to d2. Pawn c5 takes d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Bishop f8 to b4. Pawn a2 to a3. Bishop b4 to a7. Bishop f1 to d3. Knight c6 takes d4. Castle kingside. Bishop c8 to d7. Pawn b2 to b3. Knight g8 to h6. Rook f1 to e1. Castle kingside. Knight f3 takes d4. Queen b6 takes d4. Bishop d3 takes h7, check. King g8 takes h7. Rook a1 to b1. Knight h6 to g4. Knight d2 to e4. Queen d4 takes d1. Rook e1 takes d1. King h7 to g8. Bishop c1 to b2. Knight g4 takes h2. King g1 takes h2. Pawn f7 to f6. King h2 to g1. Pawn f6 takes e5. Bishop b2 takes e5. Bishop e7 takes a3. Knight e4 to d6. Bishop a3 to c5. Knight d6 to e4. Bishop c5 to b6. Rook b1 to c1. Pawn d5 takes e4. Rook d1 takes d7. Bishop b6 takes f2, check. King g1 to h1. Rook a8 to c8. Rook d7 takes g7, check. King g8 to h8. Rook g7 to c7, check. King h8 to g8. Rook c7 takes c8. Rook f8 takes c8. Rook c1 takes c8, check. King g8 to f7. Rook c8 to c7, check. King f7 to g6. Rook c7 takes b7. King g6 to f5. Rook b7 to b5. Bishop f2 to e3. Bishop e5 to d4, check. King f5 to f4. Pawn g2 to g3, check. King f4 to f3. Bishop d4 to c5. Bishop e3 takes c5. Rook b5 takes c5. King f3 takes g3. Rook c5 to e5. King g3 to f3. King h1 to g1. Pawn e4 to e3. King g1 to f1. Pawn a7 to a5. Rook e5 takes e6. King f3 to f4. King f1 to e2. Pawn a5 to a4. Pawn b3 takes a4. King f4 to f5. Rook e6 takes e3. King f5 to f4. King e2 to d3. King f4 to f5. Rook e3 to e7. King f5 to f6. Rook e7 to e3. King f6 to f5. Pawn a4 to a5. King f5 to f6. Pawn a5 to a6. King f6 to f5. Pawn a6 to a7. King f5 to f6. King d3 to d4. King f6 to f5. Rook e3 to e7. King f5 to f4. Rook e7 to f7, check. King f4 to g3. King d4 to e4. King g3 to g2. King e4 to d4. King g2 to g3. King d4 to e4. King g3 to g2. King e4 to d4. King g2 to g3. The game is a draw.